Good morning, my friends. We continue our study in the Gospel of John. I will hope to finish chapter 5 here now, and with any luck, we'll begin to look at chapter 6, because chapter 6 is the turning point in both Jesus' ministry historically and in each of the Gospels. Okay? There's this turning point where things go from reasonably well for Jesus to absolutely horrid. You see? It's like a mountain. Angels ascending and descending. The feeding of the 5,000 will be the fourth sign, after which there are 3 more. It's this turning point. And I'll show you something about those signs either today or in the next lesson, and how there's a correlation here. You'll see. So we have, in this particular chapter, already noticed, and I'm just kind of bringing us back up to speed because it's so important to remember where you've come from in a gospel as you're reading it, to just remember the flow of where the writer's taking you. Let me give you an example. I will never, ever, ever forget the very first time I read The Lord of the Rings. I was perhaps 10 or 11 years old, 1967, 68, somewhere in there. And I remember at the end of the 3rd volume when Sam walked in the door and said to Rosie, "I'm home." And that was it. It was over. I cried. It was like I wanted more. I couldn't. I didn't believe it was the end, you know. And I read The Lord of the Rings every year after that, and because I loved the story. And then sometime around a decade later, I stopped reading The Lord of the Rings, and I don't know that I've ever read it through again from the beginning, although I think I should, because part of the problem is I know the story, and I'm too familiar with it. And so when I read it now, it's like I'm bored. And I fail to notice everything that Tom Shippey points out in his beautiful book on Tolkien, Road to Middle-earth, all this intertextual weaving and echoing and things that Tolkien does with the various songs and poems as they morph and change, and word plays and this and that and the other. And I missed that. So I need to now sit down with The Lord of the Rings and just simply take all this knowledge I have of Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings and allow myself to enter into that text the way we're entering into the Gospel of John. And so as we enter into this Gospel, rather than assuming we know what this writer's trying to say and do, we want to learn everything we possibly can about this writer or potential writer's backgrounds and environments, and we can do all that. It's already been teased out by the great Johannine scholars of the 19th and 20th, and now those that are emerging in the 21st century. I could not begin to tell you how fantastic Johannine scholarship is. I mean, it's utterly brilliant. I'm not talking about the whole thing, of course. I'm talking about these landmark kind of studies that occur and become these reference points that you can then begin to build larger theses upon. But it's wonderful. There's so much wonderful work out there. I mean, literally, you can purchase the commentary by B.F. Westcott, one of the great Cambridge 3. And this was written back in the late 19th century. And although, I mean, the conservatives, of course, love it because he's the one that argues that John, the son of Zebedee, is the writer. But it's good scholarship, okay? Even if it's dated, it's good scholarship. And, of course, you could go all the way up through Ray Brown's 2-volume classic, Schnackenberg's 3 volumes. How about the one that Hoskins never finished, but they published it, and I believe his cohort, Neil Davey, helped finish that. It's a great commentary. I don't know how anyone could ever begin to think about studying the prologue to the Gospel of John without reading Karl Barth's book on that topic. some lectures he gave early on in his career. So all of this to say that the text we're in is absolutely rich, and we don't want to assume that we think we know what this writer's doing, because he's already begun to turn our heads around with double meaning words. I mean, we saw that even the greatest teacher, Nicodemus, is in the dark. We're not even Nicodemus level. No one's called you and me greatest teacher. You see what I'm saying? We're in the dark here. We need to let this writer lead us to the light. Not to the light we assume, not to our theology, not to our presuppositions, not to our conclusions, but take this journey. And up till now, one major theme that we have seen all the way through this thing is water. It's presupposed in the prologue in a way, certainly brought out very, very clearly in the Baptist narrative. It's there again at the wedding at Cana. We saw it with reference to Nicodemus. You must be born of the water and the Spirit. There is the woman at the well. There's the man at the pool. So there's this witness of water. Now, I've already told you previously, I happen to think von Waldes' theory of reading the Gospel and the letters of John in backwards order is the correct historical order. In other words, 3rd John was written first. So this is a community. It's got this theology that we'll see emerge in 1st John eventually, and then in the Gospel, or various editions of this Gospel, if the community did that. We'll see this emerge. But by reading 3rd John first, we see the crisis. And in order to understand any gospel, it's important to try and figure out its crisis. Each of the gospel writers has this central crisis in Jesus' ministry at the feeding of the 5,000. That's a crisis point. Okay? And this is what these writers are trying to do, is get us to see the crisis, the judgment. The Greek word crisis, judgment. That's what it means. It means that there's a choosing, a turning, a two ways. I could illustrate this by talking about what's known as the derech heresh in the Jewish tradition, which means the two ways, the way of life and the way of death. And you find this in the rabbinic literature. You find this in Qumran. You find this even in that particular influenced Matthean Sermon on the Mount type tradition. There are two ways: way of life, way of death, road of life, road of death. Okay, all of this is what the gospel writers are leading us to. They're saying there is a choice to be made. There's a way to follow. Most human beings are just wandering around in a fog in the dark, bumping into each other. But there is light in the darkness. There is living water where there is deep thirst. There is soon to be living bread. But it's all tied, as we saw, through these witnesses that we see in 3rd John, 2nd John. There's the crisis. 1st John says, okay, now we got 3 witnesses: water, blood, spirit. And we'll discover as we move on through that for the writer of the Gospel of John, Pentecost didn't happen 50 days later in some event in the temple. For this writer, the Pentecost event happened on the cross. That's where Jesus expired his last. And then you have the doublet of that in the upper room. Receive the Spirit. Bam, right there. It's done. So, but we're not there yet. That's the end. That's where we cry when it's over. Here in chapter 5, after this lovely sequence of water witnesses, okay, we come to this whole Christological section because Jesus is rethinking the relationship of the Creator to the creation. Jesus is saying the Creator's relationship to the creation is not a finished thing. It is a work in process. It hasn't completed yet. And he, too, is part of this creation process. Just like his father, he too is a working man to this day. That overturns everything that there is about this concept of 6 days and a Sabbath. 6 days and a Sabbath. Can I interrupt this? I wish I had somebody here. Somebody, Paul, David, Renard, anybody, remind me when I finish this story that I need to come back to this threefold testimony, please, when I say, what was I saying? Because you know I'm going to forget. I'm on a rabbit trail here, okay? There's a great story in Ernst Käsemann's book, Jesus Means Freedom. And this is back in the 50s, and he talks about visiting a pastor at that time up in a little village in Holland on the North Sea, where the fierce winds and waves and the dikes will break and the villages will flood, people will drown and die, and it's terrible. So the pastor's telling Käsemann that previous to this, there was this major storm coming in, and they needed everybody out on the dikes. And this was Saturday night. Storms come on Sunday. They need everybody out on the dikes on Sunday. That's it, hands down. So they realized they got to go to the pastor, the Reformed Calvinist pastor there in this Dutch town, and they need him to tell his people, we need all hands on deck. So he has to call the consistory together, the elders, and there's a conversation that happens, and it goes, pretty much as you'd expect with Calvinists. We're predestined. God made us. Our life is in God's hands. God gave us the commandments. God calls us to obey the commandments. One of the commandments is honor the Sabbath, and whether we live or whether we die, we are in the hands of the Lord. So the pastor tries this end around, and he says, but isn't it true that in the Gospels, Jesus plucked or justified the plucking of the grain on the Sabbath, that he broke the Sabbath laws to save life? And at that point, Käsemann says, the pastor tells him, this venerable old white-haired Dutch Calvinist elder stood up, and said, Pastor, I need to say something I've never dared say before publicly, but I've always thought our Lord Jesus was a bit of a liberal. All right, back to the three witnesses. Jesus does mean freedom, by the way. So you have all of this reframing of the creation thinking here. In other words, it's not done. And this whole concept now of what constitutes doing the will of God. Is it these rules? Is it halakha? Is it, what is the will of God? Is it all the minutiae that have to do with holiness codes or not? You with me on this? This is all happening here in and around this Sabbath narrative. This narrative of the healing of this man at the pool. These are huge halakhic discussions. They will divide Jesus from the Pharisees. I mean, at this point, even though he could be perceived of as a Hillelite, as a liberal Pharisee, at this point, Jesus is questioning how they're reading Torah. And they're reading Torah. It's not Torah Jesus is questioning. He's not going, oh, Torah's bad. Jesus isn't the Marcionite. The whole thing comes down to the interpretation of the text. How do you read the text? And Jesus read the text differently than his contemporaries. He's not anti-Semitic. He's not anti-Judaic. He's not supersessionist. He's a Jew. Let him be that. And he's reading these texts through a Jewish lens, his Jewish lens. And that Jewish lens of his certainly was purified by years of we don't know what. But there's certainly evidence of a lot of listening, education, even if he may not be able to read or write as Craig, I can't remember his last name, brilliant book, Jesus Against the Scribes is the book. He showed that there. Point. We have, as a result of this sign, conflict. Okay? Just as we saw, there's immediate conflict in the temple after the sign at Cana, right? Then we have the nobleman's son, and right after the nobleman's son, you still have that. Now the problem here, I should say, of this halakhic controversy, you have the identity, the mimetic identity. Listen carefully. It is not. There's not a claim here for an ontology. It's a claim of mimetic identity. What I see the Father doing, that I do. What the Father says, that I say. It's a mimetic identity. And that's what is going to get him in trouble. Now he says, let's talk about testimony. Remember, the entire gospel is a courtroom. It's a drama. I said we're going to have all these witnesses called, right? You're going to have true witnesses, bad witness, false, a lot of false witnesses. Okay? This is what we're seeing here. Now we're going to talk about the credibility of the witnesses. This is what attorneys do in a courtroom. Is the witness credible? My gosh, we certainly see this right now happening with the attempt to discredit every possible witness in every possible case everywhere. No, we don't care about the truth in this country anymore. We just care about who wins. We've lost our ability to recognize truth, repent, apologize, whatever we got to do. We have literally lost that ability as an American people. But this is supposed to be about the Gospel of John. Sorry. Verse 31, chapter 5, if I testify about myself, my testimony is not valid, Jesus says. There is another who testifies in my favor. Now, he's just establishing the principles they all agree on. If I testify about myself to you, if I tell you, yeah, hey, my name's Jesus, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Logos, I'm the prophet, I'm all this stuff that you've been looking for. Yep, it's me. My testimony ain't valid, he says. You know it and I know it. You're not going to accept it. And there is another who testifies in my favor. Okay, so now we got external testimony. Okay, who is it, Jesus, that testifies in your favor? Well, he's not going to tell you yet, but he's going to say, and I know that his testimony about me is valid. Who's he talking about? And then immediately following, you've sent to John, and he has testified to the truth. Not that I accept human tests. Boom. See, we aren't quite told yet. I know that his testimony is. There's another one who testifies in my favor. I know whose testimony about me is valid. One has to think at this point that Jesus is, of course, referring to the Father. And he continues now, because he can't say, I know, there's another one who testifies in my favor, and that's really God, my Father. Yeah, and I know his testimony is valid, because now they're just going to think he's double kooky. Just like anybody would these days. You walk into a police station and say, hey, I'm Michael Christ, the Messiah, and God speaks to me, and I'm his son, and I've got some things I got to tell you. They're just going to put you in a cell and put you on a little Thorazine and just make you all happy. Right? So he says, there's one who testifies about me. You've sent to John. Now, bang. He takes them down to what they did. They went to John. And he testified to the truth. Here's Jesus testifying to John's testimony about him. Not that I accept human testimony, Jesus says, but I mention it that you might be saved. Yeah. John was a lamp that burned and gave light. And you chose for a time to enjoy his light. I have testimony weightier than that of John. Now Jesus is slipping in something here. It's this you accepted this testimony. And as temporary and fragile as it was a lamp. It burned for a while. Okay? You accepted that. I have weightier testimony. So if you're willing to accept that, you should accept my weightier testimony, he says. I have weightier testimony than that of John, for the very work the Father has sent me to finish. In other words, the incarnation is the beginning of the end of the creation. That is, incarnation, life, ministry, death. I have testimony weightier than that of John, for the very work the Father has given me to finish this creation process. Who is it that announces it's finished from the cross in John 19? I think verse 34, tetelestai, is finished. For the very work that the Father has given me to finish, and which I am doing, process, testifies that the Father has sent me. There's another testimony. The works that I do are now testimonies. And the Father who sent me has testified concerning me. Where? The bat kol, the voice from heaven, the sound of thunder at the baptism. And he says, you've never heard his voice, nor seen his form. What's the implication here? I have. You have never heard his voice, nor seen his form, nor does his word dwell in you. This is very important, these three things. No one has seen God at any time. Do you remember back to the prologue? Let's look at it, because we're hearkening back. 118. No one has ever seen God but God, the only Son, who is at the Father's side and exegetes him. Now we're coming back to that. You've never heard his voice. You've never seen his form. That is, your God concepts are all wrong. What you think is the voice of God isn't, and his word doesn't dwell in you. What you call his word is, whatever it isn't the word of God. It's not the word of the Father. I have the word of the Father. If you come to me, then you'll have that word too, but your word's a different word, and you're claiming it's coming from God. And you're bothered because I'm claiming the truth from the Father. You diligently study the scriptures. Torah came through Moses. You diligently study the scriptures. Diligently. You pore over them. You exhaust yourself over them. You read them. You seek God's will in them. You play Bible Ouija board with it, or Bible hopscotch. Who knows what you do with it? People are weird what they do with the Bible. He says, you diligently study the scriptures because you think that by them you possess eternal life. They testify about me, but you refuse to come to me to have life. It would not be difficult, of course, to do an easy, hands down, utter destruction of everything Protestant Orthodoxy influence, doctrine of inspiration, B.B. Warfield, Chicago inerrancy statement, all the inerrantists and infallibilists that have to have their perfect Bible in some way. It would be so easy right now just to sit and bang on that. And it's important that we should, because we see what some of these folks are doing politically with the Bible, how they have distorted it just as badly as it was distorted by the German Christian movement in the 1930s, the white apartheid justifying Dutch Calvinists in South Africa in the 70s and 80s, and my gosh, we're seeing it abused here today in the United States. Listen, conservatives abuse the Bible. They truly do. They treat it as a sacred text, they veneer it with holiness, and then they put their interpretation on it and bow down and worship their interpretation. That's all they're doing. And Jesus recognizes this right here in the problem of halakha. Or in Matthew 23, perhaps we can remember, you strain at gnats and swallow at camels. You've got this whole universe built on 6 days and a Sabbath. And you've got these codes oriented to Sabbath. And there isn't one yet. It's not finished. And it certainly doesn't look like what you call Sabbath. So get out of your religion. Your religion testifies to me. The text you're exegeting testify to me. Pay attention, look, and see. Jesus, Moses. We've already seen the water, blood, wine, water, blood, Exodus motif. We're about to see the manna in the wilderness motif. Jesus, Moses, parallelisms. All through this text. Because this writer is engaged in a struggle in his community with some form of Jewish Christianity, or perhaps even in the synagogue, the Jewish synagogue, some struggle with those who are saying certain things about Jesus this writer believes to be false. So I think it's internal to the community. And you see that as you read 3rd John, then 2nd John, then 1st John, where there's been an exodus away from the community. And then the Gospels remembering all of this as the various editions, the writers and editors, at least the writer is remembering this. As he's writing, it's part of his ethos, part of his life. You cannot escape your life when you write. And all of this comes in here. All of this. And so you have people studying these texts today, just as you had ancients studying texts. The problem, really, of the Abrahamic religions is their view of the text. That's really the major problem of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, is how they view the text. At any rate, moving on. These scriptures testify about me. It's about the hermeneutic, man. That's why Jesus has to hermeneuein. He has to hermeneutic the guys on the road to Emmaus. He has to interpret the text for them. They're reading the text wrong. They're reading it sacrificially. I do not accept praise from men. Again, now we're back to this. I do not accept praise from men. But I know you. Now he's looking at his interlocutors. I know you. I know that you do not have the love of God in your hearts. People, you need to just before you put anybody else in the interlocutor's shoes, put yourself there. This is how you really want to play these texts. You don't want to believe what Jesus is saying about himself. You don't want to believe that he's the son of the child of the Father. He's unique. You don't want to believe that he's the absolute, ultimate, everything about the Father there is to be known, period. And that includes changing our theological models, because that's what he's doing here. Put yourself in those shoes. Put yourself as one who spends time in the Bible, who reads, who tries to understand, who maybe reads theology books, who tries to understand. Put yourself as a bit of a zealot out there. Maybe you're an activist. Maybe you're a, I don't know, whatever. Put yourself in those shoes and let this Jesus tell you, you're looking at the text all wrong. You're reading it through holiness codes. You don't have the love of God in your heart. Ooh, then the text hits you. It hurts. He says, I have come in my Father's name. There is no equivocation here. And you do not accept me. But if someone else comes in his own name, you will accept him. How can you believe if you accept praise from one another? and make no effort to obtain the praise that comes from the only God. This has to do now not just with Jesus' credibility as a witness, but the interlocutor's credibility as witnesses. If the one who is truth and testifies only to the truth and shares the truth, the Father, is not bearing witness or testifying to the Pharisees, that is, he's not praising them, then how is their testimony valid? It isn't. And they're going to hear this. Now comes the denouement. Do not think I will accuse you before the Father. Notice this is very, very important, because if we were going to read this text sacrificially, we would turn Jesus back into the Pharisees. We would make him an accuser. He's not the accuser in this trial. He's not the accuser in this trial. Your accuser is Moses, he says, on whom your hopes are set. If you'd believed Moses, you'd have believed me. He wrote about me. Since you don't believe what he wrote, how are you going to believe what I say? It's all about the hermeneutic here, people. Jesus says that the very ones who use the text to accuse are going to find that their accuser is the one who wrote the text and sought to bring this to their mind's eyes, sight, awareness, but they didn't see. They used a text that was meant to be oriented toward healing and redemption in a negative, destructive way. They didn't recognize that there's process here. You do have Genesis 2 and following after that eschatological narrative of Genesis 1. Don't you? So we come to the end of chapter 5. I'm just going to do a little setup here as we move into this business of the feeding of the 5,000. First, the feeding of the 5,000 is one of the few events that will occur in all four Gospels. You have the baptism of John, you have the feeding of the 5,000, you will have the Passion narrative, and a few small things sprinkled. But those are the main events. There's very little in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that's found in the Gospel of John, and very little in the Gospel of John that's very, very little that's even paralleled in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic tradition. But when we recall that we're not dealing with three separate traditions, we're dealing with the Markan tradition, which is midrashed by Matthew, and either rewritten by Luke or is also used by Luke along with other sources to make his gospel. So whether you do the old Griesbach hypothesis or you take your two-source theory with Q and all that, it's irrelevant. The point is, you're dealing basically with the Johannine tradition and the Markan tradition. And if Luke has another source, as Edwards might suggest, the Hebrew gospel tradition. But be that as it may, what we have here in this central narrative of the feeding of the 5,000 is a turning point event. If you read the Gospel of Mark, and as I recall, my former dean of students and later professor of New Testament and theology there at North Park Seminary, Jay Phelan, did his PhD dissertation on the doublets in Mark 6, 7, and 8. And there is in Mark 6, 7, and 8, at the beginning of Mark 6, feeding of the 5,000, and at the beginning of Mark 8, feeding of the 4,000, and then after that comes the Caesarea Philippi episode. But there's a whole thing about doublets that goes on where Mark's recreating narratives, doubling them for effect. And in the middle of this doubling occurs this huge halakhic narrative about hand washing. Pay attention here, peeps. Right before, or sandwiched in, as it were, chapters 6 through 8, right before the turn to Caesarea Philippi, you have, in this interlocking doublet narrative, a great big discourse in and around halakha. Okay? The interpretation of the text. That was the challenge that Jesus brought. How the text is interpreted. Jesus wasn't some kind of liberal. He didn't go, oh, the Bible, it's a myth, man. It's a legend, man. Like, I read Dom Crossan, man. I read Bart Ehrman, and I read these guys are like, I'm so smart, and I can, the Bible's full of crap, man. It's bad, and it's the gospel writers made all kinds of shit up about Jesus and stuff, and all that virgin birth crap. You get that crap right and left. Go to the Wild Goose Festival. You'll see it there. That approach to the text is absolutely awful. Okay, so let's come back and let's work what we actually have here. We have this doubling narrative in Mark that's, in a sense, going to be bookended by these feedings. Okay, there's so much here. I don't know that I have time to do all this. At any rate, both the Johannine and the Synoptic tradition the Markan tradition at this point, have the feeding of the 5,000, the halakhic issues, and the turning point of the ministry all together right there. So there is, it suggests to me, some historicity to this. That is, there is a growing, up to the point of the feeding the 5,000, there is a growing awareness of the Pharisees that Jesus is doing something absolutely radical in regard to his interpretation of the text. And the claims he's making to do what he does and interpret the text the way he does. He's making these radical claims. Because of all the extraordinary things that happen in and around Jesus' life, he's got the crowds on his side. Now you have to put this into a bit of sociological framework here. It says he heads out into the wilderness and 5,000 men were fed. Please pay attention to this. It says 5,000 men. One narrative says not counting women and children. And we have this image of 5,000 lonely people following Jesus. Oh, Jesus, we just can't wait to hear your words, and we're hungry. No. You got 5,000 men. You got an army. You're going out into the wilderness. You're organizing. Of course. Isn't it not interesting that both the Mark and I believe in the Matthean narratives, if I'm correct, did all this reading yesterday as I was looking at this is a synopsis of all four Gospels, and it puts them all side by side so you can see the different ways that the writers use or structure texts, the language they use. Lost that train of thought totally. I know it had to do with Matthew, but at any rate, back to this business here. With the gospel tradition, the whole thing, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you are dealing with a halakhic issue, an issue of Torah interpretation. Okay? This is the year, figure 3132, perhaps. Jump ahead just 16 years later to 48, when the Jews will decide, make halakhic decisions that they can no longer marry Samaritans. Same year, men from Jerusalem come up, influence all the Jewish Christians to no longer eat with the Gentiles. Same year that there is halakhic issues in the Roman house church, and the Claudius has to expel the so-called ringleaders, two of whom are Priscilla and Aquila, who end up in Corinth, whom Paul meets there. Our whole trouble as faith traditions hinges around this problem of perceiving religion as law. Because religion is law, people. Revelation isn't, but religion is. And we only know religion is law. Remember, there are three pillars of culture: prohibition, ritual, and myth. And religion comes before culture. This is the importance of the site Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, that is now dated several thousand years before Çatalhöyük, before sites that have human domiciles. This is a strictly religious site. It is a site of sacrifice. As René Girard postulated, and now archaeology validates, religion predates culture. Culture arises out of religion. Humans only know how to do religion oriented to law. That's the only way we know how to do it. Our whole life journey is going to be an escape from that. And this includes not just Christians, but everybody, and especially Christians. If there is ever a legalistic religion on the planet, it's Christianity. It's extraordinarily legalistic. And again, you don't have to be a fundamentalist or a conservative. You can be a progressive or a liberal Christian with all of your political holiness codes and your political correctness holiness codes and your dot the I's and cross the T's holiness codes and all of the stuff you want people to sign on to. And if they have a little minor disagreement with you, you crucify them. Same thing. The whole of Christendom reads the text this way. Fortunately, there have always been pockets that have read the text non-sacrificially, that are reading it the way we're reading it now. And also, fortunately, there is just absolutely phenomenal and overwhelming amounts of evidence that substantiate the way we're reading it now. Anthropologically first, theologically second. We're looking for what the effects of the text are as we follow this writer's thought. And now we're coming up to this place where we too, like the crowds, have seen all these signs. And now we're going to get a big one. Because who do we perceive this one to be? I'm going to give you a hint. If you look down at the end of the narrative, and this is only in the fourth gospel, it's not found in the synoptic tradition. In verse 14, it says, after the people saw the semia, the sign Jesus did, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. That's a correct declaration of faith, is it not? I mean, it's the same one the Samaritan woman made in chapter 4 and that the Samaritans did in chapter 4, right? He's the prophet who's to come into the world. And look what they do next. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, they now attach the Davidic piece to this thing. And that's the problem. See, the prophet thing was correct, but you attach the Davidic piece to it, that messianic king piece, when there's already a king in the land, Herod. There's already a Caesar in the world, in Rome. You see the problem? The crowd has a correct recognition of him, and they're about to make the biggest mistake they could make. And that's make Jesus political. Pay attention here, peeps. Pay attention here. Because the only way they know how to make Jesus as political is to do it inside their system by force. They will make him king by force. They will go out. He will ride them to victory as their conquering king. This is a zealot army, people. This is not just people that were hungry and had a little lunch and felt better about themselves. These are people that are ready to rock and roll. And they see Jesus doing these signs, and they know God's got to be with him, but they got God all wrong because they think God's all about force and politics, and God isn't. And I'll tell you what, right now, I have never seen in this country such absolutely incredible madness in the theological world as I have the last 20 years. I mean, I can go back and read anything in the 20th century in America, and I'll tell you what, Jesus has been turned into a politician, and you can't do that. You can't make Jesus a politician in your framework. You can't do it in the sacrificial mechanism. You can't do it with a sacrificial hermeneutic, and that's the only way we know how to do religion, culture, and politics, period. And that's why all of this stuff, is Jesus a communist? Is Jesus a capitalist? Is Jesus left-wing? Is Jesus right-wing? Is Jesus the wrong conversation to be having? All we're doing is making Jesus like us at that point. We're failing to recognize as he stands before the procurator, Caesar's representative, wants to know, are you the king? He's going to say, my kingdom isn't of this world. If it were, I suppose my followers would fight, but they're not fighting. Let me put it this way. You can write all you want about Jesus and politics and Jesus and your politics, liberal or conservative, and you can justify your politics by appealing to Jesus. You can do that all you want, and you will have missed the point every time. You're bearing false witness to Jesus if you do that. You need to take this perspective. It's the problem, not the solution. There is a solution. The solution's here. You're following it. You're learning it. You're not there yet. You're like Nicodemus. You're in the dark still. Okay? But you're about to see and have that break because it's coming in chapter 6. Okay? Just like in Mark, where there is a break in and around the issue of bread, there's going to be a break here in chapter 6. There's going to be whole questions about Christology and misreading Jesus and misunderstanding Jesus and making Jesus out to be in our own image. This is the problem here. This is the problem. And we're all going to be exposed to it now. And it's an awful, bloody mess. It's when you get into this Eucharistic discourse, you will see this. We're being led here. Wine, blood. John 6, blood. Cross, blood. Wedding at Cana, sign 1. Sign 2, healing of the nobleman's son. Sign 3, the pool at Bethesda. The center sign, number 4, feeding of the 5,000. Blood, blood, blood. Sign 5 is going to be the healing of the man born blind. That parallels the healing of the guy at the pool, where there's both halakhic issues. How come you were healed on a Sabbath? Who's this guy? And then the raising of Lazarus from the dead parallels the healing of the nobleman's son. There's your parallel. That's why the nobleman's son is there as the second sign. And then the cross parallels Cana. Blood, blood, blood. There's your chiastic structure of the signs in the fourth gospel. Just like that. Hope you've enjoyed your lesson for today. I hope you are taking things away from this. Please, friends, this is what I'm going to do for the month of April. I'm just going to keep producing these Gospel of John videos. If they're valuable to you, you'll support them. If they're not, then I'll find other ways of generating some income. I'm not telling you you're doing God's work by supporting me. You're not. You're just supporting me. End of story. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't. You don't have to be here. Nobody makes you be here. But if it's valuable, support it. The labor is worthy of their hire. And I'll look forward to next time. Cheers.